So I went through these rules. I compiled them. I wrote code that sort of formalized them, and then I used them to develop a program that, given a noun and given its gender, attempts to use these rules to explain why this noun takes this specific gender.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Simon Zuberek gives us a look into his custom applications for language learning.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to welcome back Simon Zuberek.
Simon is a senior educational technologist, linguist, and language educator, and we will talk today about corpora, data, and their application and validity in the language classroom.
Welcome back to Speaking of Language, Simon.
Hey, good afternoon. It is awesome to be here with you guys. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Simon, before we dive into all things data and corpora, please remind our listeners a little bit about you, your background, your path with languages, and the things that you currently do for work.
I started out as a graduate student on the PhD track in Germanic literatures and cultures. And
Wunderbar.
Dankeschön. And that was at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And as I was sort of working my way through the program, I discovered that I was really interested in the questions of language acquisition, language learning, language teaching, pedagogy. And before I sort of knew it, I got so involved in that area of studies that I decided to change tracks. And I did complete my education with the German language program with a master's with a focus in second language acquisition studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of moved into applied linguistics
Nice.
full time, where I also completed my degree also with a master's. And that was simply because the program at the time did not offer a PhD track. And so while I was working on things related to applied linguistics, I ran into computer-assisted language learning, and I just got hooked. I got really interested in how technology can be used in the language classroom to address specific pedagogical problems, how these technologies function, how we can have students work with them in the most useful way. And over time, as I began looking at these technologies more and more critically, as I was learning more and more about these things, I started coming up with problems that are not very easily addressed with the technologies that are available. And so I started looking for custom solutions, which just sort of organically led me to start thinking about how do these things work? How do you develop these things on your own? Whether you can customize them, or maybe just like write code on your own. I mean, that time I was not a programmer. I did not know anything about programming, about writing code. So I kind of stayed at that level. So that sort of interest in computer-assisted language learning and language technologies has led me to my thesis, where I looked at the effectiveness of speech technologies in the training of oral proficiency. Finished the thesis. completed the program. I was able to get my current position at Columbia, where I am today helping instructors and sometimes students as well answer interesting curricular and pedagogical questions that sort of come about and emerge in the foreign language classroom. And at the same time, I am also pursuing my interests in language technology by working at a graduate degree, yet another one, this time in computational linguistics at the CUNY Graduate Center here in New York City.
Nice. Awesome.
Very
Sounds
cool.
like you know how to keep yourself busy.
Yeah, I've never had problems with that. You guys know it.
So you started touching on this a little bit, but could you talk a bit more about how you became interested in Corpora and using data to support language teaching and learning?
Yeah, sure. So, right. So as I mentioned, as I began sort of looking more critically at the questions that are sort of present in the field of computer-assisted language learning, a lot of these have to do with, how do you design and, develop, various technologies that can be then used later to address specific pedagogical questions and situations. And, in order to begin developing such technologies, in most cases, you need data. So, for instance, so going back to my time in Chicago as a graduate student in applied linguistics, I became interested in questions of oral proficiency and a little bit more specifically oral fluency, right? And so as I started researching these questions and this topic, it became clear to me that we don't really have a good sense of what oral fluency actually is, what it actually means to be a fluent speaker, right?
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be a clear consensus of how we define it. There are a number of criteria that can be used to sort of qualify it, right? But sort of in order to answer the general question, we would have to look at the confluence of like various different measurements. And then one of these measurements, it turns out, could be silent pausing, right? So essentially, how many times does a fluent speaker naturally hesitate in discourse, which could be one of the things that are, again, indicative of how fluency is being perceived. And of course, you can measure that relatively easily. Just collect a speech sample, put it on the computer, and then sort of manually look at the waveform and try to see where these pauses occur. Now, of course, when you are writing a thesis that sort of holistically looks at these things, you're dealing with a lot of speech samples, and that is at some point just stops being manageable to do by hand.
Sure.
Right. And that is exactly what happened to me. So at that point, I remember that was the first time when I seriously started considering automating things. And I looked at, okay, so how can we automatically sort of extract this information about pausing in these various sound samples I collected? I figured out how to write a script that does that automatically, which is like the first original, piece of programming that I did. And it also generated like a very rudimentary fluency score. That sort of already gives you an idea how data quantitatively may be useful in, answering certain questions. I mean, maybe, probably not giving you the full picture, but bringing you, closer to the truth, so to speak. And then there's, other questions that, exist sort of on the side of the instruction as well as on the student side that are likewise, that could be answered with the data and with sort of objective metrics.
Interesting. So you just mentioned that in order to manage all of the data that you were working with, you wrote a script to automate some of the processes. Can you give us the Cliff's Notes if somebody is interested in creating a corpus? How do you do that? How do you go about that? And are there other reasons than automation for why one should create a corpus?
Yeah. So going back to fluency, right? Just like there isn't like a clear consensus of what fluency is, how we define it, it is really also pretty difficult to sort of give a clear definition of what a corpus is.
Mm.
I like to think of it as a collection of some language data of interest, whether it's text, audio files, maybe a combination of both, that is structured in a way that is helpful to achieve a particular goal, right? To facilitate its use. And so to give you a more concrete example, so one of the more recent projects that I developed that we can talk about later required validation, right? And so I basically needed to see how effective it is, how well it works, and in order to validate it, I needed to use a corpus. In this case, the corpus was very, very simple, very straightforward. It was a list of about 100,000 German nouns that I scrapped from the web. And they were all sort of dumped into one text file. And the way that, and so that kind of, answers the question of what was in the corpus. Now, in order for this collection of German nouns to be useful for the validation purposes, which was done automatically by a program, they needed to be structured in a particular way, right? And so in this case, they were all arranged as a list that are all case folded, meaning lowercase across the board, one noun per line going all the way down, right? And this very simple text file was a legitimate corpus structured in a particular way, so as to facilitate a specific goal that I had in mind when putting it together, right? So that's sort of on the one side, but then Corpora can also be a lot more involved, a lot more structured. There was another corpus that I worked with for yet another project that was developed by Professor Naomi Nagy, at the University of Toronto, and it is the Heritage Language Variation and Change Corpus, which is massive trove of data, both audio and text. It is a collection of interviews with heritage speakers across a number of languages, with transcriptions, with a search capability, with all sorts of filters. So, in that case, that allows you to, manipulate information, extract it, process it. It has, all sorts of functionality sort of baked into it. And, it is likewise a, valid collection of data, right? A valid corpus.
Yeah.
And the reason why we should be interested in looking at these things and then looking at the collection of these collections of data, in addition to sort of, building programs, is because I think that they really allow you to look at the language in a very, very objective way, a very insightful way, and find answers to questions that oftentimes crop up in the language classroom that don't really, they're not really clearly stated or clearly defined in textbooks, and sometimes are not really very well, answered by instructors. So yeah, I mean, they could be, so for example, it could be things like, looking at common, inflectional errors that are committed by heritage speakers, right? Or it could be like patterns of collocations of English quantifiers, right? So, we know by looking at corpus that quantifiers such as a bunch of tend to collocate with expletives
Sure.
in English more often than not, right? And this is not something that you will ever find in a textbook, and this is definitely something that comes up when you look at a corpus, right? And so the question then becomes for you as a language instructor: okay, is this something I should be paying attention to? Is this something that is useful? Should I, let my students know about that, right? And if so, like, how should I let my students know about that? How should I draw their attention to this? How should I then, structure my materials to that effect, and so on and so forth?
Nice.
Yeah. Well, so just to follow up on part of that, you talked about the corpus of German nouns that you assembled. You developed a learning aid to explain grammatical gender assignment in German around that corpus. So please tell us about that learning aid, and for the non-German speakers among us, how to pronounce it, how to pronounce its name.
Oh, yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Trick question.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no corpus answer to this. I pronounce it. I pronounce it as Genucidator. I kind of spelled it out phonetically as J-Nu C day as in Monday and ter Genucidator. I don't know, Angelica, how would you pronounce it?
Well, I mean, if you take the German word Genucidator, but that I'm not sure. It's funny because it also reminds me of Genuss, rather than genus, and that's kind of cool because I mean, genus is gender and Genuss is what is Genuss, Simon?
Usage, right?
Well,
Oh no, not usage.
no,
Sorry.
like the pleasure
Enjoyment.
of enjoyment. Yes.
There we go.
So the
Yeah.
enjoyment idator.
Of gender.
Yes.
Yeah, gender enjoyment, not safe for work. Okay, I need to rebrand this. So what is this thing? Why did I build it? So I am not a native speaker of German. I had to learn it as a foreign language. I started learning it in high school, and sort of stuck with it through undergrad and then grad school. Always been really good at it. Always liked it. It made sense to me, except for the articles. That was the sole thing that I could not wrap my mind around, and it was just, it was just confounding, and like I said, didn't make any sense. And so, as students, we're always told, or at least I was, that the articles, so articles in German correspond to the grammatical gender of the noun, right? So German has three genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. And these surface in the language as an article, either definite or indefinite. We also have articles in English. An example of a definite article would be the. An example of indefinite article would be a or an. When I was learning the language, and I still am learning the language, there didn't seem to be any sort of rules, any rhyme or reason as to why certain nouns are a certain gender. Why do they have this article or not some other article? The longer I've been thinking about it, the more it became clear to me there's got to be a better way to to acquire this knowledge than just memorizing it, right? That there's got to be some rules undergirding this system. And as I was researching it, I came across sort of two approaches. On the one hand side, you could look at the morphology of the word, and here, or the noun, and here I mean its affixes, so either its suffix or its prefixes, because as it turns out, certain mostly suffixes prefer certain genders and certain articles more than others. So, for example, like we know that German words that end in letter E or A, as it is pronounced, tend to be overwhelmingly feminine. I mean, like 98%, right, of them. And, these sort of regularities occur with various suffixes, sometimes with prefixes. So that was one cue for me. Another one was sort of more of a semantic nature. I ran into research that tried to figure out how genders are assigned to nouns based on what these nouns mean, right? So we know that most celestial bodies in German are masculine, right? We also know that alcohols are masculine as well, except for beer. We also know that things that are related to hunting tend to be feminine, so things like that. And there are rules and rules, pages and pages of these rules, which I went through. And
very diligent of you. I like that.
Yes, very German.
Yes.
And project was
Sam
very
didn't
meta.
want to say it. Yes.
Well, I didn't need to. Is all that matters.
So I went through these rules. I compiled them. I wrote code that sort of formalized them, and then I used them to develop a program that, given a noun and given its gender, sort of attempts to use these rules to explain why this noun takes this specific gender. And and so, okay, great. So how well does this thing work? Well, it turns out that it is not entirely terrible. So when it comes to its accuracy, in other words, how well these rules describe the specific gender assignment of interest, the rules that are morphological in nature, so where we look at the prefixes and suffixes, account for 74% of accurate guesses. So in other words, out of 100 nouns, 74 of these nouns are going to be guessed correctly, solely based on the endings or the prefixes. On the other hand, the whole semantic thing, where different groups or types of nouns tend to take different genders, that is not very effective. There's very little sort of mileage that I was able to get out of that. So when it comes to the rules and the explanation generated by this program, if I were a student or an instructor, for the matter, I would be, paying more attention to the morphology than the semantics, right? But one way or the other, now with these rules in hand, right, you are able to see, okay, that this specific noun is this gender, probably most likely because it has this ending or it has this prefix, right? Which, I think is useful. And honestly, I could wish that I had that kind of, learning aid when I was studying the language.
Nice. Yeah, just have to figure out exactly how to pronounce the name of this wonderful learning aid. I like it.
Yeah, it's a marketing issue.
I see. Yeah, well, you got to get your team on that then. So, Simon, what are some other beneficial uses of Corpora for language teachers and language learners, other than, you mentioned useful collocations, figuring out grammatical features? Are there other things that are great uses for Corpora?
So starting with students, the thing that first comes to mind is machine translation,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that students use on a regular basis. And of course, when you think of machine translation, you think Google Translate. Now, of course, as ubiquitous and universal as Google Translate is, it has a pretty steep learning curve, in my opinion, because you, generally speaking, when you input a word, it will generate translation. But of course, that you don't know if that translation is correct or not.
Sure.
There may be a number of translations that are equally correct, and unless you already know the language well enough, you're just guessing. I mean, it's and this goes sort of back to what Chomsky said about dictionaries in general, that they're by and large useless unless you already know the language.
Mm.
So okay, so should we then tell our students not to use Google Translate? Well, not really. I mean, we can, but they're not going to listen. They're still going to be, translating using that technology or using machine translation in general. So is there a better way to do it? And I think this is something where Corpora could be useful
Mm-hmm.
because, if we can imagine a technology that not only generates a translation for a specific word, but also shows you how that translation works in a sentence, in authentic
Oh.
context, and that being juxtaposed against the original word being translated and how that works in a specific context,
Mm.
right? And there is a tool that does that for you. It is called Lingway, Ling, U-double-E, and it is a machine translation technology that does precisely that. So, it works on single words where whatever word you input, it will generate in addition translation its usage in an authentic corpora whenever possible, which is more often than not. So I think, this was something that is generally super helpful to students, even if they may not necessarily understand the entirety of the
Mm-hmm.
lexical context.
Sure.
They may still see it, maybe look at this and maybe try to translate the sentence as well. So I think for the purpose of contextualization, it is fantastic. And then, of course, for instructors, these database, Corpora-based tools are, we've likewise been using them, especially for the past, couple months with the full assault of generative text
Mm-hmm.
models. I mean, these are based on, multi-billion word corpora.
Yep.
That's what they are.
Yep.
Um, but to perhaps present a more specific example, there is a project that I developed that looks at heritage language writing, and specifically in Polish. So the program takes a written sample, composed either by a heritage or a non-heritage learner of Polish in this case,
Mm-hmm.
and then classifies it accordingly with a certain degree of accuracy, right? This program is it's available on my GitHub. It can be downloaded, used. It is pretty accurate, but it was developed and built based on a corpus of heritage and non-heritage written samples, right? And this is something that was of interest, or still is of interest to our instructor of Polish, But it turns out that there is a need for something similar in our Spanish language program that has a lot of heritage speakers, a lot of incoming heritage speakers, and where sort of this initial diagnosis, right, this diagnostic between that would allow professors or that would allow the program administrators to differentiate right from the get-go between heritage and non-heritage speakers, like that would be very helpful for them. That would save them, a lot of time. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, so this is something that would be a little bit difficult for me to develop. But that would be a good example of how Corpora and how data can be used by instructors. Oh, here's another good thing when it comes to writing. So when we think about written proficiency and how our students are most likely to write in the authentic context, what immediately comes to mind is texting. It's things like Reddit. It's perhaps gaming, chatting, right? So instantaneous computer-mediated communication, which is profoundly different from regular composition, which is something that tends to be emphasized in more traditional language classrooms. Now, of course, I am not necessarily familiar with a lot of teaching materials that includes samples of texting discourse or authentic online discourse, right? Which the exposure to which would be, I suspect, very helpful to our students and for instructors as well when thinking about how to build useful curricula. But again, there are corpora out there that collect this information. And for instance, at the last IELTS conference, I participated in this presentation where a graduate student from UC Davis was presenting her project on computer-mediated communication and texting in Spanish. And she was looking at how that instantaneous communication may impact spoken proficiency, right? So again, she put together a corpus on her own. She collected data, she structured it, and she's using it to look into these things and to answer these very specific questions.
There's a lot that you're working on, and it's fascinating. So we want to know what's next for you, and where can people find out more about the work that you're doing?
Sure. I look forward to the upcoming academic year at Columbia. We do have pretty ambitious plans in store for our faculty. The center is currently undergoing reorganization, and there's exciting changes in place. So I'm looking forward to that. There are some innovative projects that I've been consulting and working on with our faculty. There's a really cool project on that uses spatial scaffolding. So not corpora, but also computer assisted language learning related, and it does that to see if we can use leverage the fact that our brains are mostly wired for spatial processing to teach grammar. And to specifically to teach, not to teach grammar, but also in the context of prepositional semantics. So when looking into that, there's also a project that looks at ways of incorporating automated speech recognition and pronunciation feedback in Mandarin Chinese. So that's something that I'm involved in as well. Exciting stuff. My graduate work. I'm gonna be taking more courses this upcoming year. I am looking forward to doing more nitty-gritty machine learning and learning more about the math behind it. So that's sort of coming up for me in the next months. Nice. And then, where can people find out more about me? I do have a website, Zuberek.net. So my last name, .net, pretty simple to remember, which kind of contains everything. So everything I do, I just, throw it there. There are links to our YouTube channel. There are links to my presentation, slides, code. It sort of aggregates everything. So go there if you want to learn more. I also have links to various social media channels. Just leave it at that, because that really does contain everything.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure to link to that in our show notes. Simon, this was wonderful. I think we could keep talking forever, but we will just make sure that everybody who's interested in your work goes to your website, checks out GitHub, and you are presenting at ACTFL 2023. So if anybody is there...
Oh, yes, that's right. I'll be there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, make sure that you check out Simon's presentation there. Before we sign off, though, we would like to ask you to share a word in a language that you speak, you love, you are learning, you want to learn, that does not exist in English, but that you wish it did. Let's hear it.
Okay. Well, I guess the Genucidator is already taken. that already exists, though. I put it there.
It does. Yeah.
So
You've coined it. Yes,
I coined it. No, but there's a word that there's a word that I wanted to share. I was thinking about a little bit. So a lot of the work that I do on Corpora with data, I do on an operating system. I'm sorry. A lot of the work that I do is done on a version of the Linux operating system that is named Ubuntu.
Mm-hmm.
And some of you may have heard about that. It happens to be, I think, the most popular distribution of Linux available out there. Even though looking at that name pretty much daily, I never really bothered figuring out what it means. And until I did in preparation for this, or coincidentally to this podcast, and it translates into I find my worth in you, and you find your worth in me. And
fascinating.
I think we could think of it as just a really super rough translation as human kindness. And I wish that a word like that existed in English.
Yeah, that would. I would take that. I would use that. Very good. Do you know what's the origin of the word?
It's from Nguni Bantu.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today, Simon. That's a great note to end on.
Thank you. It's been great. It's been a fun conversation.
Next week, we will speak with Dr. Kathy Bauman. Dr. Bauman recently gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series, and we will extend our conversation on reverse design and its role in curricular and programmatic articulation.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.